Thank you. So I'm going to talk about, from data to content, the process of defining meaning. So first of all, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Cyrièle. I'm a senior user experience at the BBC. I'm French. Go France. Last time I checked, we were winning, so I don't know what's going to happen by the end of that talk. I studied user-centered design and development in France at Gobelin School. And I started my career as a developer, back-end developer and front-end developer, so at the time, full-stack developer. But then I was quite frustrated because I was always the last person getting the mock-ups and having to make it work. I wasn't involved in the design phase, basically. It was the project manager, because at the time in France, more than 10 years ago, user experience design wasn't a thing. It didn't exist. So I was quite frustrated by this, and I wanted to be involved upfront. So I changed my role, and I became a project manager, because we didn't have UX designers at the time. So I worked for like 7 years in France as a project manager. Then I moved to the UK, and I realized that in this country you do have UX designers like working on UX design full time. So I changed my role again, and I became a UX designer specialized in information architecture and data governance because of my background as a back-end developer and database architect, basically. So why am I telling you this? It's because although I'm called a designer, I'm a system thinker, and I'm everything but a pixel pusher. I'm really not a visual designer, which sometimes is a bit like weird for people because they expect me to make things pretty. So since I started at the BBC 3 years ago now, since I joined the BBC, I've been working in a product called BBC Account. So I don't know, does anyone here watch iPlayer? Yeah. So I guess recently, well, like a year ago now, you faced the nice model that says you need to register and sign in if you want to watch iPlayer. I'm responsible for that annoying thing. I'm really sorry. No, I'm not really responsible for it, but I'm responsible for the sign-in process, the registration process, and everything related to storing the user's data. So your setting area where you can change your password, change your email, which is also the place where you can submit a subject access request to get all the data that the BBC holds about you. So my product, BBC Account, belongs to what we call Audience Platform, which is a suite of products about the audience. So you have BBC Account in the middle, which is the identity management platform, but you also have a big database called Single Customer View that stores everything we have about you. So it can be the details that we have from BBC Account, but it's also the tracking analytics that we have. It's also the activities that you perform on the website. So for example, when you play a video, it's an activity to play a video. When you read an article, it's an activity. When you bookmark something, it's an activity. So everything goes to that database called User Activity Service. And then based on this, the BBC creates some features that brings benefits to the audience. For example, notifications. So notification is based on the things that you follow. And if you follow things on the website and you turn on notification, you enable notification, then you're going to receive notifications on the things you followed. And we also have recommendations. So if you signed in on iPlayer, you can see at the bottom there is like a module recommending stuff, and it's based on your consumption. So all this is provided by Audience Platform. My line manager described my role once as an interaction designer, but at a database level. So basically, I try to make sure that the UI, I try to ensure consistency of meaning from the UI to the database. I try to make sure that the user intention is going to be conveyed through the interface without ambiguity and going to be stored in the database exactly as the user intended it in the first place. So by doing this, we want to enable personalization, and this is the strategy that we have at the BBC for pushing content to users. So in order to offer a good service and face competitors such as Netflix, we've had to actually enter the world of personalization. So Audience Platform and BBC Account enable other products such as iPlayer or BBC Sounds. I don't know if you've checked out the new app that's just been released. It's brilliant. to tailor content to specific users when these users are signed in and they have enabled personalization. So here again, thanks to GDPR, we offer control to our users, and if they don't want to be tracked, they can turn off personalization. But they're also going to turn off the benefits. So in order to enable personalization, we need a few things. We need to know our content. So it's brilliant because Paul actually explained how we know our content at the BBC by tagging it and by creating links in between all the pieces of content. It's great because I'm not the one working on this. It's my colleague Vicky now, who works in internal system tools, and she tries to make people understand that when they create an article or add something on the BBC website, they have to tag it because it's not going to tag itself. She tries to make them understand that they have to teach the machine that the machine doesn't know. So basically her work is to make sure that we define the content accurately, the format of it, which genre it is, who stars in it. Then we need to know who you are, and that's the role of my product, BBC account. So we provide a unique identifier that then we share with all the different BBC products. So we know who you are, and we know that you're the same person in every single BBC product. We also check, thanks to that, the information we have about you, we have your age, so we check that we have the right data sets for each user. So for example, because of GDPR, again, we're not allowed to store any information that would allow us to contact someone who is under 13 years old. So the rules are really strict for under 13 years old. That's why most of the big media websites don't allow under 13 to create an account. We do it because we want children from the very first age to build a relationship with the BBC. But then it means that we can't store all the data that we store for adults for under 13 years old. And because of this, we also know that, well, we can allow some users to participate in some features. I'm just going to give you an example because I'm not clear. A user over 16 years old is allowed to comment on BBC News. A user over 13 years old is not allowed to comment on CBBC website. So we have some age restrictions. We also need to know your taste. We need to know what content you previously engaged with, on which product, and on which platform. So whether you added the podcast on BBC Sounds or played an episode on iPlayer, as long as you interacted with a piece of content, it counts as engagement. So obviously on a scale from 1 to 5, watching a full episode from the beginning to the end and bookmarking something is not going to weight the same. So we have a weight system to understand your engagement with a piece of content. So how does the BBC personalize content? We use segments that we create from single customer view, SCV, the big database that stores everything that we have about you. And we also use recommendations. So I'm going to quickly run you through how our recommendation engine works. So we have a user who is signed in and using iPlayer. Every time a user reads the information about an episode, or watch a show from the beginning to the end, or bookmark something. Previously we had love. We got rid of love. It's as sad as it sounds. But yeah, as soon as a user interacts with a piece of content and is signed in, we store that information in our big database called User Activity Service. Then when that user lands on a page that has the recommendation module at the bottom, it calls our recommendation engine. So what does the recommendation engine do? He gets the information, so he says, I want to have all that information, you UAS, I want you to give me all the information that you store about that specific user. So based on this, we're going to create a taste profile. We're going to understand what that user likes, what the user engaged with. And then we're going to try and find people with a similar taste profile. And we're going to recommend the stuff that that person has watched and that you haven't watched yet. This is what we call the collaborative recommendation. Then once we have that list of content, we go and call the big databases that store the content itself to get the information from the name, the URL of the show, the name of the show, all the information from the show. We send it back to the recommendation engine. That sends it back to iPlayer. So what does that mean? It means that the personalization is only as good as the data that we have. So we are trying to create a common grammar to create cross-products benefits. For example, it means that we need a follow, which is stored in the user activity service database, to mean the same thing everywhere on the BBC. When you follow Siri on, not a Siri, it's called a brand. When you follow Doctor Who on iPlayer, it means that you want to know what's gonna, like, the next series or the new episode which is gonna come out. When you follow a football team, it means that you need to know how France is scoring. Oh my God, I'm so stressed. They were, yes! Sorry. So cool. Yeah, so we need the vocabulary, we need the meaning of the activities that we store in UAS to mean the same thing across the board. We need to clearly define what it means. Because it makes it really difficult to communicate when two individuals don't speak the same language. Par exemple, si je vous avais parlé français depuis le début de cette conférence, je pense qu'on aurait eu du mal à se comprendre. Yeah. And it's exactly what happens on BBC websites. So here you can see that if you have a plus add button on iPlayer, and it's actually used as a follow. When you click on it, it sends a follow activity to the user activity service database, UAS database. And it means, and because iPlayer has implemented the notification feature that we provide, it means that a user who would click on plus add on iPlayer would follow the thing that they added and would receive notifications. Homepage has not implemented with the notification feature, but you're going to see the same plus button that looks the same. It's still a follow, but you will not receive notifications. For us, internally, it makes sense because we know homepage has not implemented with notifications, but from a user point of view, why is that? How would you make sense out of it? In radio and music, now called sounds, it's actually a bookmark. You have a plus button. When you click on it, it sends a bookmark type of activity. And notifications are not based on bookmark. Notifications are based on follow, because you want to, if you follow something, it means that you want to, at least as per the BBC definition, it means that you want to know what's going to come next. And when you bookmark something, it's usually a still piece of content, which is not going to evolve, so you would never receive any notification based on it, because it's not going to evolve. And in music, you have add to my music, which is a bookmark. So it's not exactly a plus, it's plus add to my music, and it's a bookmark. So it's very inconsistent. Aligning on meaning cross-products means more rule and constraint to follow when you implement it. It also means revisiting legacy, which is a huge issue in a company as old as the BBC. Trying to convince stakeholders in charge of siloed products who have their own roadmap and objective that they should care about what their neighbors are doing, it's a huge challenge, especially when you're no stakeholder yourself. It means that product must understand that fixing issue collaboratively will impact positively their individual roadmaps. So how can we speak a common language? Which approach should we take? A collaborative one. We need to be a team. I'm so happy because if we had lost, it would have been horrible for me. So collaboration first and foremost. It starts with gathering requirements and understanding needs. When a request is made by a product to create a new activity in UAS, for instance, not only do we ask them to explain the business benefits they will get out of it, but also ask them to explain the user benefits they will provide with that data. It has to work both ways. It has to make sense. Advocating for your discipline. We're about 10 UXA at the BBC, and if you think about the amount of data and information that we have, that's not a lot of people. So chances are that people you're going to work with have no clue what you do. So I was telling you earlier that most people assume that I'm just going to make things pretty. I remember one day, the first time I met the UAS team, the User Activity Service Database, they were like, oh, great, a UX person, you're going to make our documentation look pretty. Like, no, I won't. Actually, I'm going to be a pain because I'm going to ask you to consider more constraints when you store your data in the database. Also, advocating and raising awareness around the importance of having data governance processes in place. So data governance is everyone's responsibility, whatever your job title is. It ensures good data quality and security throughout the life cycle of the data. The best way to show the importance of something is to involve people in the process of finding the solution from the beginning. And then you have to make it real, make it happen. So in a company as big as the BBC, guidelines like this have to be documented if we want to have a chance to see them implemented. Every document I create are seen by like 100 of people. We are like 150 UX designers at the BBC. So even though we try our best to know what other people are doing in other teams, it's difficult to be up to date and to know exactly what they are doing. So this is why we have a design system called GEL, Global Experience Language, and formerly about visual patterns, but I created the very first IA guideline. Ta-da! So that's the very first IA guideline that we created and that we published in our design system. It's a great achievement for me, for the BBC, because that's the first time that we create something which is not 100% visual. That's actually not visual at all. When we created it, we had no idea what the reactions would be. So it's about a new activity that we are storing in UAS. The idea came from children. They wanted to offer, the smiley faces that we have on Facebook. It started like this, actually. It was pretty funny. They just approached us and said, we want to store faces, like smiley faces in UAS, like Facebook. So, okay, fine. We started what we call the task force. So we asked every single product at the BBC, would you be interested in something like reactions? So we were like taking the temperature, and some of them said yes. So some were more involved, some were less involved, depending on roadmaps. But we had like responses from pretty much every single team. And when we asked for, okay, you want reactions, but what do you want exactly? What's the benefit for you? What's the benefit for the user? And at first it was just, we want what Facebook does. And it was quite difficult to make them understand that Facebook is a social media. So if you click on a smiley face, it means that you want to show your friends your reaction toward a specific piece of content. On the BBC website, it's not a social media. So if you click on a face, you're the only person who's going to see it. I'm not saying it's useless, but just you can't do like Facebook if you're not like Facebook. So we really had to ask them that question several times and show in one document, show what every single product wanted to do with those reactions so that they would be inspired by each other and understand the challenge that it has to work for everyone. So in a nutshell, content strategy starts at a data level and should be considered when technical decisions are made that impact the meaning of the data which is stored. Designing an experience starts way before what the user sees, and that's why information architects should be involved in those discussions too. My job is actually here. I'm really not before the screen. But it's a shift in mindset. Guess what? I'm a designer, and I won't make your visual interface pretty. I really thank voice devices for this. At least proficiency in Sketch will stop being the norm in every single job description for UX designers. It takes a lot of convincing, gathering of people, and understanding of everyone's agenda. Being right is only 10% of the job. That's what my line manager keeps telling me. So being a good IA is required, but it's not sufficient. Solving the information architecture issue is the easiest part of the process, even in a place like the BBC where IA challenges can be quite knotty and difficult. So getting to an agreement with everyone involved is always the hardest part. It's a people challenge. That's the conclusion of my talk. So share the love for meaningful experiences, please.
Thank you very much, Cyrièle. Have we got any questions for Cyrièle specifically about her talk? Again, very informative talk. Are there any more questions sort of globally? We've got all of our speakers here. Is there anything? Yes?
From the personalization standpoint, because we're looking at personalization here. Obviously, we're a specialist content company. And looking at that with the data team and so on. How do you identify, like, if you're trying to set up the personalization aspect, and sort of the first thing you start with is obviously the content and those groupings that actually kind of you started with, setting that up in enough time so that they don't sort of say, okay, can we have personalization by next week? You know, sort of how do you say, okay, what is the amount of time and work that needs to go into the structure and the organization and the understanding of the data in order to deliver that? So, I mean, it's a kind of a how long is a piece of string question, but, you know, how long do you have to do, for example, any kind of personalization efforts against a particular project at the BBC? Because sometimes people say that and they think it's just as quick. It's just yet another thing to do on somebody's website. Oh, yeah, we have the data, we have the content, we have our tags. Just make it personalized work, you know, and that's the kind of, how do you tackle that conversation?
Oh, so I think that when you work at the BBC, you know that nothing is fast. I mean, everything is super slow. So that
we know that here because we license most of the BBC magazines. So trust me, we know that very well. Appreciative empathy for you.
Yeah, so everything takes time. I know that Tony Hall talked about personalization as being an objective before I joined the BBC, and I joined in 2016. Yeah, well, don't remember. And basically, they decided at this point, they realized at this point, after years and years of debates and everything, that the identity management platform that we had in place wouldn't work. Couldn't stand the charge, the amount of people that we would need to be signed in if we wanted to enable personalization. So it took a lot of time for people to understand this. It took a lot of time for the BBC to actually say personalization is an objective. I think it's only because of Netflix, basically, or stuff like this, that we understood that we had to do something to be better, to have a better public service. And it took a year and a half for my team to deliver the identity management platform. And at that point, we already had the content. I can't tell you how long it took to actually tag the content, but if you've worked at the BBC for 10 years and you worked on it, that's the scale. So tagging the content took a lot of time. Creating the identity management platform took a year and a half of making. I don't even know how long it took of like deciding it.
It's just sort of working backwards, thinking that it's just being able to kind of use those examples against, you know, other properties that are saying, okay, look, we're all excited about personalization too. Can we do that?
You know, I think
and you're like,
it also really depends on the company. I mean, if I was working on Netflix, because it's a digital native company, they created their structure with data in mind and with personalization in mind. That was part of their business model. That wasn't part of the business model of the BBC. So we work with so much legacy, things that we have to change. It takes a lot of time. So I guess it depends on the amount of content, and it depends on how much legacy you have to deal with, I would say.
Just to follow up on that, I'd say the other thing is that you don't have to have the perfect thing first. Like, start with, what if you could recommend one thing in one way, do the simplest thing, get something out there and see whether users actually want it, whether it works. Because that's the only one. It's only once you've got actual real data of how users are using it that you'll know whether it's worth investing further. So yeah, find the simplest useful thing you can do. Take it from there.
Yeah, actually on that point, we are still trying to find the best way to test new activities. So I was talking about reaction, but it's been said during the discussion we were having that maybe it's not worth creating that new reaction activity in UAS right now. Maybe we could just track if users are clicking on a smiley face, because at the minute we don't have any benefits. Well, we're still trying to work out the solution. I'm not saying that we found the right one. There are pros and cons for everything, but yeah, we need a sandbox, basically.
This is a question sort of for Paul, but maybe for everybody, about the structural relationship between different kind of categories of information and taxonomy, and initially developing that taxonomy. If you work across an organisation with subject experts where you know literally nothing about what they do, it can sometimes be difficult to facilitate things like card sorting and exercises like that. I kind of wondered what the kinds of exercises you might use to get to that very critical, fundamental taxonomy of things that link together, and if you had any recommendations on things that you could use and workshop.
Yeah. Is this one? Yes, it is on. It feels a little bit like cheating, but sometimes it's really about kind of getting people away from thinking about the website or the kind of work context of it, and just having the conversation, like getting them to describe how they understand the subject, the thing they're really passionate about. And whilst they're describing it, making note of the nouns they're using and the verbs they're using. And as you're doing that, as you're creating that list, then you also, maybe in a second step, begin to sketch out that kind of model of it, and then sharing that with them and saying, okay, this is how I've understood what you've said. Does it make sense? And kind of collaborating with them to draw up that model. That's kind of the first step to doing it. I think also trying to build that empathy of the experts will know the content really, really well, but they may not empathise with users who aren't experts. So a good technique there is looking at kind of your search analytics and what keywords are people using to search the site, and how does that compare to the language that your experts are using, and trying to show them that, you know, what we at the BBC may have called a brand or a series or an episode, most people just say a programme, and so bridging that gap between them really helps.
Have we got any more questions at all? Awesome. Well, a big round of applause to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for your time this evening.